Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And look, I literally cannot cover everything that dropped this week in my normal style on this show. Not only were there comfortably over a dozen albums that could fill up spots, but we're talking about some of my most hotly anticipated projects of 2020, and also a pretty busy week where I'm working on finishing up my top 100 best albums of the 2010s, and that video is long as balls. And plus, I got a lot of real-life stuff that you'll see on camera within a week. Big changes are coming, let me describe that. Plus, the shooting for this has been absolute hell. Ergo, if you're wondering why Sufjan Stevens isn't getting covered this week, it's because I need some time to sit and think with that bloated thing. Same with the back catalog from Deftones that I really need to revisit to make sure I'm on my game. With all that in mind, here's what I could get to on the Pulse. So we got 6 albums on the docket. Let's start off with From Action Bronson, Only for Dolphins.
My toes, but I will still fuck these. I might not be able to touch my toes, but I will still fuck these.
Here's an honest question. Was Action Bronson ever that good? I don't think I've ever talked about him at length or felt really the need to care about the guy. I remember him having a crossover single with Chance the Rapper years ago that did briefly chart, but then Ghostface Killah that same year destroyed his career without even a song thanks to a video with a Teddy Pendergrass backing track that I would argue might be funnier and more relevant to hip-hop culture at large than anything Action Bronson has ever said or done, and that might include his cooking show, which is good for the record, but let's be honest, it's not on that level, it's Ghostface. And I went back to the albums and the tapes that people say they like before his major label signing, like the Blue Chip series and Well Done, and look, Static Selecta can make anything sound good, but even he couldn't salvage some of the excruciating retrograde swagger that Bronson was trying. I mean, a lot of those albums have not aged well at all. But now it's a decade later, we got this pretty short project that's actually received some good press for Action Bronson for once, and, well, it is probably his best in a while, but I'm still not all that impressed. A big part of this is Action Bronson himself. As a rapper, he's descriptive and colorful, but he's never had a lot of dimension as an MC when it comes to his content or his flow, which has led him to cultivate an image as a gluttonous, drug-abusing gangsta horn dog, but almost to the point of becoming a caricature of one. Big warning here, Griselda crew, if you're not careful, this sort of thing can happen to you too. And with Derringer handling some of the production, it's an easier parallel than it should be. But alright, maybe he falls closer to a Rick Ross mold in terms of the braggadocious mafioso posturing, just swapping out a lot of the pathos that Rick Ross has been trying to build for loose humor and food references. And that would have an audience, especially in New York. At the very least, you can tell that Action Bronson's grown up a little bit, and there's considerably less edgelord crap that's leaking through the edges. But like with Rick Ross, there's kind of a limit to how much I can really say about him. I hear a little bit of maturity by the very end, but not much evolution in the content, and I'll say it again, constant excess can get really repetitive really fast, especially when I don't find all the wordplay all that striking or funny. Truth be told, once again I found myself liking a lot more of the production than Action Bronson himself. Lush, splashy touches of New York smooth jazz, a lot of horns and warm bass lines, which might be kind of luxurious, the watery touches, the splashy pianos, and even some of the dolphin squeaks, but it's still not quite giving me enough to get around Action Bronson at the center of all this in the same way that Static Selecta could really pull off. But at the end of the day, look, for Action Bronson's target audience, this will be just fine, probably better than average. For everyone else, it might be his best in a while, if only kind of decent in my books. At least it's short. 6 out of 10, it's good. Not really my thing, though. Next up from Ayreon, Transitus. Okay, let me make this clear. The last time Arian Lucassen deviated from the forever plotline in the Ayreon project, we got the Theory of Everything in 2013, which is one of the best metal albums of the 2010s. Hell, one of the best albums of the 2010s. I was not against him making a pivot here, even if the sign of him releasing this in tandem with a comic book had me kind of worried, because you shouldn't need supplemental reading material to go along with your concept album, which Arian Lucassen should know because he's been doing it successfully since the 90s. But alright. Alright, fine. New Ayreon project. Tommy Karavik from Camelot is the lead, along with Cammy Gilbert from Oceans of Slumber, Simone Simons from Epica, Dee Snider from Twisted Sister, and oh look, Joe Satriani and Marty Friedman, formerly of Megadeth, they're on guitars, plus a pretty robust stacking supporting cast, and oh hey, Tom Baker. Yeah, the former Fourth Doctor, he's providing the narration here. That's a stacked cast, so of course I had high expectations, and yet I hate to say it, this falls short for me, to the point where I kind of wish Ayreon had continued with this plan to make this a non-Ayreon project. And I want to start with the plot here, such as it is. Our 1880s protagonist marries a servant girl, he gets disowned by his family, and then he dies in a tragic accident, or what might be one, that his vengeful family wants to pin on his grieving widow, and yet before he is sent to heaven or hell, he has to find some sort of way to save her life from beyond the grave. Oh, one more thing. The servant girl is black and the rich family is white. And wow, I'm not at all comfortable with Ayreon Lucassen writing about race in 2020. This is not the sort of timeliness you would want. That's not saying he couldn't do it. The best Ayreon albums have complexity and moral ambiguity that can come through despite some ham-fisted writing. But there are two major problems here. Number one, none of that nuance really materializes, either in the characters or the plot, because even more than the source, this album feels like it's working in increasingly broad archetypes, and the whole tragic misunderstandings and deceptions, they feel very melodramatic and Broadway, and lacking even that punch. And two, following up the major issues I have with the source, Ayreon's lyrics are sliding towards clunky modern colloquialisms that don't match the attempted gravitas in these scenes at all. They certainly don't sound like they're from the 1880s. It's a serious tension-breaking element for me, but that would assume there's much tension to break, because not only does Tom Baker's narration describe in way too much detail every plot point, show, don't tell, how am I giving this direction to the mastermind who created so many expansive and memorable concept albums? But this might be the most undercooked and lacking in dynamics an Ayreon album has ever been. You would think that much time spent in a spirit realm, there'd be way more focus on atmosphere beyond some very similar chilly synthesizers, or you touch upon some weirder textures or tones given that it's uncharted fantasy territory, or maybe even steampunk. And if you're gonna make the obvious Easter egg references to the Forevers and the human equation specifically, precisely the wrong comparison to make given certain parallels, and the fact that the human equation is a classic and this is not, why not pull more textures from there rather than tones that make me say, well, it sounds like Ayreon, but where are the rest of the killer hooks? And why is this not nearly as interesting as it should be? I mean, you can argue some of this has been an issue going back to the theory of everything, and that the songs don't really have as much structure anymore, but that album had an engrossing narrative that could compensate for all of it, at least for me, whereas here, a lot of pieces feel undercooked. I've seen Ayreon put out a couple different statements apologizing how physical copies of the release are missing lyric sheets and credits, and I'm circling back to how this might have just been a complete mess in more ways than expected, both on and off record, and yet even then, I don't really think it's bad. You put this much talent in a room, you might wind up with a misguided mess, sure, and I honestly think it kind of is, but I also can't deny enough raw quality shines through to produce at least a few legit high points. The mix might feel a little bit more gaudy in splashes. Okay, a lot more gaudy, but some of the horns, the flutes, the pipes, touches of harpsichord, and some choppy acoustics, they remind me of a fond, quasi-nostalgic way of the Final Experiment, but cleaner and brighter, and that's a tone I thought Ayreon should go back to years ago. And I'd argue a few of the songs that feel a bit more organized and composed, they're solid, like Listen to My Story, Get Out Now, Condemned Without a Trial, Hopelessly Slipping Away, and The Great Beyond, mostly on the part of Simone Simons and Cammy Gilbert, who really make the best of what they have to work with here, and especially for Cammy, I don't think it's a lot, but they do sound great, they sound beautiful. Hell, I'll even stick up for Dumb Piece of Rock for being a pretty solid metal tune, even if the lyrics are goddamn asinine. But I also have to admit, this might have been the album that disappointed me the most thus far in 2020. And considering how other projects on this week kind of fell short, that is saying a lot. I mean, it's a strong 6 out of 10. I'm being generous where I know some critics will not be. I just hope Ayreon turns things around. I know he can, but hopefully soon. Next up from IDLES, Ultra Mono. Alright, look, IDLES is a band that's earned some high expectations. The first two albums were great, they were wild, a ton of fun, absolutely worth hearing, and generally could rise above some of the scene backlash I've noticed against them in some recent months. But I did get a slightly uneasy feeling when the buzz felt a little muted going into Ultra Mono. The singles I had heard I had liked, but it was just the unease of potentially not just missing expectations, but falling a lot shorter. So I was worried about this. And unfortunately, some of those worries might have wound up justified, because this is absolutely the sort of step back that comes from a band where the ideas are starting to run a little bit short and the slogans are starting to turn a little bit hollow. Now, there are some qualifiers to all that. Raw bluntness can have some power, and IDLES has always been raw and blunt, and this can happen to a lot of political punk bands that get big, which that's a tradition that goes back to the 70s. Look at The Clash, and the accusations that they're being condescending to the average small-town UK voter is one to which I assign a massive asterisk. We don't castigate American pop-punk bands when they put suburbia in their own country righteously on blast, so I can smell some of the bullshit when certain salty acts from that scene and media outlets try to inflate that caustic narrative overseas. But IDLES would be a lot easier to defend if the music and content hadn't taken a slight downturn, which unfortunately it has to a small degree, specifically surrounding some of the stiffer grooves and some of Joe Talbot's delivery, which takes a little bit too long to build up the intensity needed to really sell some of the more ridiculous lyrics, especially some of the onomatopoeia. And it also doesn't help matters that it seems like the tone of some of this anger has changed. Not only is there a trace of real sourness that comes to looking at your social media a little too long, but I'm not hearing the same well-balanced dimensionality that can make IDLES both riotous and kind of heart-wrenching, which is to be expected from a band that's no longer the underdog, fine, but the answer is not to push back on your populism, or drive your harsher, blockier percussion and bass where the closest analogs might be in the early 80s no wave. There are comparisons you can make to Swans on this album. Now this might also be an issue of content, as the project is a lot more outwardly political, and they sure as hell have the power to land those body blows, but this is where that slight drop in populism should at least be somewhat compensated for by the writing. This is where the Swans comparison might not help them, and I'm not sure it always does. As a related aside, this has been an issue for politically minded music for years, but it's growing in recent times. A lot of songs playing the ally role have felt increasingly clumsy across multiple genres, and I do not think IDLES nails their best attempts here. There's a song with Jenny Beth that tries to call out catcallers, and while I agree with the sentiments, it doesn't quite stick. Not helped by the fact that Jenny Beth doesn't even get a verse. But a larger issue again might be tone. As much as the sourness might be righteous if it with a darker, heavier waves of guitar, there was a lingering sense of desperation that really ramped up the riotous intensity that isn't here in the same way. And let's be honest, I do not think IDLES were ever going to write a more dark and powerful moment than Baby Shoes for Sale, Never Worn. And when the palette of this album gets darker, that sort of absence comes up. Now, all that being said, I am making all these harsh criticisms because, like with Ayreon, the core fundamentals of IDLES are so goddamn strong, you're gonna wind up with a very good project regardless, frequently great. The nervy, hammering riffs of Anxiety, the quasi-surf rock, garage rock, guitar relic of Model Village, the coursing bass driving up the middle finger at Tories in Parliament on Carcinogenic, even the whirring, swans-like stomps of rain somehow managed to work for me, although I probably have the biggest soft spot for The Lover, which is some of that old swaggering mischief that makes for the best of IDLES songs and came back from their last two, which makes the legit depressed gut punch of a hymn, The Soul Slow Down moment, pretty impactful, especially with some of the brighter tremolo riffing as the backdrop. But you know what, in the end, it is a great album, let's be real here, but I'm also reminded of thoughts I had on Algiers' new album earlier this year, because a very similar percussion-heavy focus slid to the forefront, and you can tell the world weighed pretty heavily on both acts, which is what happens when artists desperately try to make something that clicks in times of great strife, which is why Donkey showing Joe Talbot trying to buoy spirits by the end is a good touch, and it's probably hard for them to stick that landing. But thus, I'm going to give this an 8 out of 10. Not their best, absolutely flaws, might even be their weakest album to date, but it still is great. I appreciate the effort. Next up from Joji, Nectar.
For falling in love, baby, on me.
True story, the first time Joji really impressed me was not on the singles he'd get to crack the Hot 100, most of which I really like, but when I accidentally wound up seeing him live at a festival last year. Hey folks, remember music festivals? They were something, right? Look, I wound up going with a friend because she needed somebody large to help her get close to the stage. Here we go. And let's make this very clear. From what I saw, Joji's a star. The magnetism and stage presence he has live is legit stunning, and he can absolutely deliver his songs with the swell and grandeur he was trying. And you know what? That impressed me enough to go back to Ballads 1, and well, there was work to still be done. The production wasn't really consistent to match and amplify that presence. He's better live than on record there, and the writing did not always help, but again, I knew with the singles in the lead up to this project some of that had been fixed, and thus with the follow-up, it's an improvement, but I really wish it held up to the promise of those singles. Let's get this out of the way now. This is a project that unfortunately has the very same unevenness as Ballads 1, just with a much more bloated structure, which means that there's more good, but not quite great, or super distinctive pop/trap/R&B, Khalid crossed with Frank Ocean, and a splash of James Blake crooning in order to get to the best moments. It also doesn't really help matters that the album feels a bit front-loaded, with the guest stars brought in to shore up the back half not really impressing me much, especially Yves Tumor and Lil Yachty. I mean, after a pretty strong 3-track run with Gimme Love, Run, and Sanctuary, and surprisingly there's singles there, the project gets a lot less consistent, with probably Afterthought from Benet, Your Man, and maybe Mr. Hollywood as the remaining standouts. What I actually realized midway through this project is that the more Joji goes for some slightly quicker, driving bass grooves that don't automatically default to trap or show more expansiveness in his vocal arrangements or some of the guitar and synth textures that he uses, the more that his unique flair in his composition and for melodrama really shines through, especially as this album keeps a much better pace courtesy of a dynamic low end than I personally expected. And while he can deliver some of the smaller moments, they stick the landing a little less often, most because the writing is still not quite getting there. Not that it's bad by any means, it's clearly got some of that strained, slightly desperate pushiness that he can't quite pull off, and any matching that with flexing does not help whatsoever. But I will give him some credit for being a bit more self-aware and more empathetic in examining just how much his presence might be a time bomb in relationships that he's probably pursuing for all of the wrong reasons, and really has to deal with some internal stuff within inside him. And his post-breakup musings on that fact are emotionally honest in a good way. The song he has with Benet, where she holds him accountable, that's nice. You can also tell he's not really adjusting to fame all that well, and seems acutely aware of how his mercurial personality is bouncing off that, and it leads to a few plain-spoken but pretty good realizations. But this is a project that really needed to trim itself down or show more diversity in the subject matter to amplify that, because the angst starts to become kind of very familiar and a little played out by the time we get to the end of it. Still, I will say it's better than I expected, which might as well be the tagline for any experience I've had with Joji or his music in recent years. And the best moments here, they do show volumes of potential. So, light 7 out of 10. It's got flaws, but it's still pretty damn good. Next up from Lydia Loveless, Daughter.
I wonder if it ever was. I shouldn't have to break you down to build me up.
Apparently, this is just going to be the week of high expectations for me, but with Lydia Loveless, I was a little bit more realistic here. It was like when I covered Rustin Kelly's Shape and Destroy a month or so back. It was never going to hit the same resonance as Dying Star did 2 years ago, because that album connected with me at a very vulnerable point in my life. And that was even more true with Lydia Loveless's 2016 album Real, which I still hold as one of the best albums of the 2010s. So with Daughter, I was bracing myself for disappointment. And while it's somewhat true, I'm also self-aware enough to see a lot of the same advancements that I really liked on Real continue onto this album, which by the end of things winds up pretty damn great. Not better than Indestructible Machine or Real, and I'm not sure it's got the killer standout of Everything's Gone from Somewhere Else that I just adore, but this is still really, really damn potent and consistent, and shows her pushing her sound into more nocturnal, starry territory, with some slightly slower tempos, brighter guitar lines, including some really nice jangling progressions in the electrics and acoustics, and more keyboards and synthesizers to augment a more atmospheric mix, where some of the melodic progressions, the vocal lines, and especially the bass grooves, they kind of remind me of a spacey, modern Fleetwood Mac in spots. And that fits the unsettled progression of the album, where Real was still very raw and touching on her fresh divorce. Daughter is trying to dig a little deeper into where things went awry for her, which means it's naturally more introspective and complicated, the sort of album that recalls therapy at its best, not just in the round-like, mantra-like structure that ends a couple of songs, but also because Lydia Loveless never really absolves herself of any culpability. She can be that honest, which also helps that the touches of the Fleetwood Mac vibe, come to think of it. And she also cuts into some really difficult territory, not just in terms of alcohol abuse and depression and other self-destructive tendencies and her own habit of loving too hard too early, but also given how she's interwoven some of her personal stories into her art, how some can come to perceive her as what she's created rather than who she actually is. And her own idealized picture isn't always the reality, especially when love for someone else will just consume her point of view. But dear God, she wants that ideal. She wants to embody it. And that real tragic ambition is genuinely potent, especially opposite guys who won't understand and don't treat her with the same level of passion, which makes a cut like the title track so devastating. And I don't think there's many writers or singers today who can make such the frank romanticisms balanced out with the wistful dreams of escape work on September, which with Lauren Jane Grace providing backing vocals adds a certain very distinctive context that only makes it cut deeper and probably with more dimensionality than maybe even she realizes. Again, I'm not quite sure this album has the striking immediacy or tremendous high points of Real, and it is absolutely more of a slow burn, and I can also admit it can be kind of hit and miss in how long slow burns wind up sticking with me long term, but this is still great stuff. 8 out of 10, highly recommended. You'll want to hear this. And finally, from Machine Gun Kelly, Tickets to My Downfall. Then you showed up and I can't get enough of it. I mean, do you open up with the joke that he plainly set up in the album title, or do you remark on the fact that Eminem killed his rap career so hard he had to change genres? Now, believe it or not, I'm kind of okay with that. The rap rock thing in the mainstream is picking up traction. Machine Gun Kelly has not sounded bad at it. And let's face it, it couldn't possibly be as trash as his 2017 album Bloom, right? Well, here's the thing. This album is trash in so many senses of the word, and its hip-hop moments are obviously cribbing way more than they should from the late Lil Peep, and it also works way better than it has any right to, in that this might be Machine Gun Kelly's best and most honest project to date. No jokes about that. I had way more fun with this than I expected, and that's kind of because Machine Gun Kelly seems at least somewhat self-aware of the mercenary melodrama he's spewing. He's transparently kind of phony and full of shit, but at least for once he's being somewhat honest about it and placing it in context, which is the one reason I don't put him in the same camp as the other derivative pop punk that's trying so very hard to rip off Blink-182. In that swagger and attitude works in pop punk, where a slice of more sincere and respectable bands, and their defenders, they would dismiss this as derivative and meat-headed. Mostly because it is, but also kind of ignoring the rampant immaturity and toxicity that has cut through pop punk's roots for decades, really since its inception, and how this album is probably way closer to how many of them actually behave. And when you strip away a lot of the braggadocious preening that Machine Gun Kelly could never really sell as a rapper, he slots into the transparently plastic, over-compressed side of pop punk really well. The hooks and riffs are punchy, even if they don't have a ton in the way of distinctive texture I've heard far worse in pop punk this year, helped along by Travis Barker showing up on drums and production, and giving this, frankly, way more quality than it deserves. And yes, Machine Gun Kelly is a bad singer, but rarely in a way that's obtrusive or outright annoying. He's serviceable for what this is. The melodic grooves, they're solid, and while Halsey shows up on Forget Me Too and sounds better than she has on anything, possibly ever, I honestly didn't even mind when Trippie Redd, Ian Dior, and even Black Bear show up here. Yeah, that song with Black Bear actually grew on me a lot. No jokes here. This is an album from which is screaming out for at least one Lil Uzi Vert guest appearance, because given the energy he brought to his albums this year, he he would fit perfectly. It's the same sort of vibe. Honestly, this is probably an album that could have afforded to be wilder, more debauched, and even stupider. Yes, that even includes those interludes, which are impressively dumb. And outside of Lonely, which is a surprisingly real song dedicated to his late father, and maybe the song dedicated to his daughter, Play This When I'm Gone, you can absolutely argue that outside of when the overcompressed mix starts to lead to some songs running short on momentum when the melodies don't quite punch as hard, when this album leans into its rambunctious, wild hooks, it can be a ton of fun. And if you can tune your brain to that sort of debauched, mercenary idiocy on display, I'm gonna endorse this in the same way I will Andrew WK's I Get Wet. I can't and I won't say that I'm above this. It's way too much fun for me to hate. So yeah, light 8 out of 10. I fucking went there. It's better than it has any right to be, and it's a blast. Y'all should ignore the not good. Check this out. You might be surprised. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I can't imagine how anything I said in this review will surprise anybody, but if you're curious, comments down there below. Have fun. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, if you guys want to get involved in my schedule or help any number of the incredibly too many albums that dropped last Friday to show up on my schedule so I can cover them, link to my Patreon right over there, where you guys can request projects through that method. Again, don't feel any obligation. We are all in very tough times, and again, I don't want you to feel stressed about anything here, but if you want to, the option's available. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and, well, I'll see you next time. Got some special on the way.